בהלכתך סלע, השם צבאות עמנו, נשגב לנו אלוקי יעקב סלע, השם צבאות אשרי אדם בוטח בך, שמושיע מלך ידינו ביום קראנו, ליהודים הייתה אוי רב ושמחה וששון ויקר, כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועות אשא ובשם השם אקרא.
A good vach, Shavua Tov. A good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. We're starting it right by learning some beautiful Talmud. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Saturday night to learn page 24 in Tractate Chagigah, the 14th volume of the 13th volume of the Talmud? Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, James in Indianapolis, Stephen in New Hampshire, Tom in PA, Carrie in Santa Clarita, Melissa in Great Neck, Leah in LA, Nancy in North Carolina, Barranquilla, Esmi Ciudad in Miami, Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, John in Surfside Beach, South Carolina, Paul in Augusta, Georgia, Gwen at a wedding reception. We'll catch you on the flip side. Have a great party. Leona in Southern Illinois, Bella in Florida, Donna in Alabama, Amanda in Eureka, California, and Clarice says Shavua Tov. And over there on the YouTube side, no one yet. Welcome, everybody. How's it going? Quick announcement. This is my Shabbos jacket, actually, right? I've shared many times. I'm part of a volunteer force called Magen Am. We're licensed as we're volunteers, but we're licensed as security guards so that we can carry a firearm, exposed carry. In shul, I wish we didn't live in times when that was necessary, and I hope to God that soon it will not be necessary and until the end of time. But meanwhile, we have to take precautions. So the reason I mention it is because tomorrow I'll be attending a training all afternoon and evening. We're going to be requalifying. We have to requalify regularly. I take the training very seriously. If we're going to carry firearms, we have to be very well trained and prepared. And also, we're having a session on night, training, right? So sometimes the bad guys come at night, and we have to be prepared for that. So we'll be on our tactical range, about an hour and a quarter north of Los Angeles tomorrow, having a practice session on that. Why am I mentioning it? No class tomorrow night. No class at the regular Sunday time of 6 p.m. And we'll have a double daf, God willing, on Monday when we resume. Okay. So we are in the third and final chapter here in Tractate Chagigah. These are the laws of the festival peace offerings, and now we've been really getting in deeper on the safeguards that the sages decreed to ensure that the sacrificial offerings would be in a state of purity when they were brought in the temple. And because sacrificial offerings are the highest order, we've got to guarantee that they're in a state of purity. So there were stringencies even beyond the stringencies that were passed to ensure that teruma remained in a state of purity. And we've been examining the differences in those stringencies here on the first Mishna in chapter 3. With God's help, we'll be completing that Mishna tonight and opening the second Mishna. The Mishnah states, a vessel combines all the food that is in it with regard to sacrificial food, but not with regard to teruma, right? Teruma is that portion of the produce of a farm, for example, or of a vineyard, or of an orchard that is set aside, the first 2%, for the priests, for the Kohanim. It must be eaten in a state of purity. It can only be eaten by priests and their household. The priest and the people in his household must be tahor, right, in a state of ritual purity, and the teruma itself must be in a state of purity. And so there were stringencies passed for the teruma. But even beyond those stringencies are the ones for sacrificial offerings that were brought when the temple was standing. So this is one of those rules. A vessel combines all the food that is in it. With regard to sacrificial food, meaning that all like for example, if it's flour for a meal offering brought in the temple, then all of the flour in this vessel, even if there's sort of like two clumps of it that aren't even touching, but if they're in one vessel, so if one of them becomes impure, both of them become impure. All the food in a vessel combines with regard to impurity. That's so for sacrificial food, but not for teruma. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? What is the source of this stringency? And Rabbi Hanin said, the verse states, with regard to the sacrificial donations of the tribal princes, 1 golden pan of 10 shekels full of incense. That's Numbers 7:14, which teaches us that the verse treats everything inside the pan as one unit, even if the items are not attached to each other. I mean, it's interesting they're deriving that law from that verse in the 4th book of the Torah, Numbers, or in Hebrew, Bamidbar, and this idea that on Yom Kippur, right, the high priest brings the special pan with the incense in it. There's also, or I'm not sure, it might be referring to just the daily offering of incense, and there was a different sort of coal pan on which the incense was brought. I'm guessing a golden pan. So we know it's for Yom Kippur, right? The daily pan was not golden. So the golden pan of 10 shekels full of incense, and they're going to say full of incense, 1 pan. So, for sacrificial matters, not just food, right? So there's also frankincense as part of certain offerings, the incense itself, and the coals in that pan are all going to be susceptible to impurity, and whatever's in them is going to combine. Rav Kahana raised an objection against this based on the Mishna that teaches in Eduyot 8:1 that Rabbi Akiva added to the list of it items that are considered combined when in the same vessel. So what did Rabbi Akiva add? Fine flour, incense, frankincense, and coals, saying that if one who immersed himself that day but is not waited until sunset. This is a person who was tamei, right? He contracted some kind of ritual impurity. He immersed in a mikvah. Now he's done all the actions that he needs to take in order to become purified, but he won't complete his purification until the sun sets and the next day comes. That's a Torah law, biblical law. So this is a person, a Tevel Yom, who's awaiting the end of the day. He is basically pure, but he's not, right? He still has some of his impurity on him until the day ends. And so if he touches this vessel, the items in it, everything in the vessel is going to become impure, right? Fine flour, incense, frankincense, and coals. Rabbi Akiva said that if one who immersed himself that day, but has not waited until sunset, touched a part of the contents of a vessel containing these substances, all of the vessel's contents are disqualified as the vessel combines them. Isn't this, because you might have thought, and it is so, that for teruma and offerings of lesser, objects, items of lesser sanctity, like non-sacred food or non-sacred food prepared according to higher standards, that if the impurity came into contact with one of the items in the vessel, so that item would be disqualified, but the other stuff that it didn't touch and that didn't touch that item didn't become impure. And that sort of leniency, or it's more like that's what it should be. And then the stringency for sacrificial offerings is because we go above and beyond when it comes to things that are offered in the temple. But for lesser things, we don't want to be so stringent, because as soon as something becomes impure, everything in the vessel becomes impure. Somebody will sustain a big financial loss, and we don't want to impose that on people unnecessarily. So isn't this halacha, this law, that these substances are considered combined, right? When impurity comes into contact with them for sacrificial, when it comes to sacrificial offerings, isn't this law by rabbinic law, meaning it's a rabbinic decree, not a law in the written Torah. From where do we know that this is so? From the fact that it teaches in the first clause of that Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon ben Beteira testified with regard to ashes of purification in a vessel, the ashes of the red heifer that were needed to purify a person who came into contact with a human corpse, before he could become purified and enter the temple when the temple was standing. Shimon ben Beteira testified with regard to the ashes of purification in a vessel, that if an impure person or object touch part of it, it renders all of it impure. That's actually the highest level of that we need to guarantee purity, the ashes of the red heifer, even above the sacrificial offerings. The purification ashes of the red heifer are neither food nor a sacrificial item. So Rabbi Chanin's verse does not apply to the ashes, and the vessel certainly does not combine the ashes together by Torah law, but rather by rabbinic law. And it is taught immediately following this, Rabbi Akiva added, which shows that Rabbi Akiva's halacha, like the previous halacha, deals with the additional level of impurity instituted by the sages rather than a Torah law. Meaning, when we're talking about that these stringencies are added to ensure the purity of sacrificial foods, and even more stringencies added to ensure the purity of the ashes of the red heifer, these were stringencies added by the rabbis. It's not spelled out in the Torah. They have some basis in the Torah as the sort of foundation of the decrees that they pass. They always have some kind of a foundation, or at least a hint in the written Torah. But it's not spelled out in the Torah. These are stringencies added by rabbinic decree. And Reish Lakish said, in the name of Bar Kapara, now we're at the top of 24a, Rabbi Akiva's testimony is not needed to teach the basic halacha that a vessel combines its ingredients, which is Torah law, right? So they're arguing whether this is rabbinic law or Torah law. Why would it matter? It's still a law. Answer, because in cases of doubt with respect to rabbinic law, we're lenient. And in cases of doubt with respect to written Torah law, we are stringent. That's one of the reasons. It is necessary only, why is Rabbi Akiva's law necessary? It is necessary only for the remainders of the meal offering. The part of a meal offering, right, a flour offering of fine flour that was offered when the temple was standing. It was a daily offering brought by the high priest, a meal offering. The part of the meal offering left over after a fistful of it and its frankincense have been sacrificed on the altar, and the leftover is eaten by a priest. In such a case, the law of combining applies only by rabbinic law. For by Torah law, only when an item requires a vessel in order for it to be sanctified does the vessel combine it with regard to impurity, even if its parts are not touching each other. But in the case of something that does not require a vessel, the vessel does not combine it. The remainder of a meal offering no longer requires a vessel, since it is given to a priest after the fistful is sacrificed, so the flour in a vessel would not be considered combined according to Torah law. And so it was so combining it for the purposes of impurity was an additional stringency decreed by Rabbi Akiva, a rabbinic decree, not a Torah law. And the sages came and decreed that even if something does not require a vessel, such as the leftover flour of the meal offering, the vessel nevertheless combines it. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. It works out well in the case of flour, which can be said to refer to the flour left over from meal offerings. But with regard to incense and frankincense, what is there to say? In these cases, a vessel is certainly required. But if the halacha, the law of combining applies to them from the Torah, why did Rabbi Akiva include them in his list? And Rav Nachman said that Rabbi Bar Avu said, for example, if he piled them up on a leather board, kartavla, rather than in a containing vessel. By Torah law, a vessel, something that we call a vessel, a kli, that has an inside combines its ingredients, but one that is flat and does not have an inside does not combine what's inside for the purposes of if one part becomes impure, all of it becomes impure, right? A bowl, if it has an inside, and if something inside the bowl that's going to be a sacrificial offering in the temple becomes impure, everything in that bowl becomes impure. but a board does not have an inside. It has a top, it has a bottom, but it doesn't have an inside. So if there was some, frankincense here and some coals here and some incense here, and one of these things became impure, the others do not become impure. So Rav Nachman said that that one is flat and does not have an inside, does not combine. But the sages came and decreed that even if it does not have an inside, it nevertheless combines what is placed on it, a rabbinic decree of an additional stringency for sacrificial offerings. And the Gemara comments, and this opinion of Rabbi Chanin's, that impurity by combining is derived from the Torah rather than by rabbinic decree, disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Chiya bar Abba. For Rabbi Chiya bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said in reference to our Mishna, this Mishna was taught based on Rabbi Akiva's testimony. In other words, the Mishnah is teaching that a vessel combines its contents for the purposes of sacrificial offerings, follows the statement of Rabbi Akiva, indicating that it is by rabbinic law, unlike Rabbi Chanin, who said that it is based on a source from the Torah. New subject. It was taught in the Mishnah. The fourth degree of impurity with regard to sacrificial food is disqualified. So when something that is a source of impurity touches something else, it becomes something with first degree impurity. And if that impurity gets transferred to something else, it's second degree impurity, which doesn't transmit any further, except in the case of something consecrated like teruma, which can catch third degree impurity, which cannot transmit the impurity further unless it comes into contact with sacrificial foods. And that's fourth degree impurity. But fourth degree impurity is not something that can go any further. It just means that the thing that has become impure is disqualified from being brought as an offering, but it can't transmit it any further. So the fourth degree of impurity with regard to sacrificial foods, it's really the only place where it comes up is sacrificial foods, is disqualified, meaning it disqualifies the food, but it won't go any further. It is taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Yosei said, from where is it derived with regard to the fourth degree of ritual impurity, that with regard to sacrificial food, it is disqualified? It is a logical derivation by a kal v'chomer. If in a simple case we make this ruling, then in the tougher case we for sure make that ruling. If one who is lacking atonement, meaning an impure person who is obligated to bring an offering in order to complete his purification process, who is permitted to eat teruma, is nevertheless disqualified with regard to the consumption of sacrificial food, as specified in the Torah, then, concerning something that is impure to the third degree of ritual impurity, which is disqualified if it is teruma, is it not right that it should engender a fourth degree of ritual impurity when it touches sacrificial food? Therefore, we have learned that there is a third degree of impurity with regard to sacrificial food from the Torah, and that there is a fourth degree of impurity from our kal v'chomer derivation. The above baraisa taught that there is a third degree of impurity for sacrificial food from the Torah, right? From the Torah, not by rabbinic decree. And the Gemara asks, from where is this derived? Where do you find that in the Torah? The Gemara answers, as it is written, Leviticus 7:19, and the meat that touches any impure thing shall not be eaten. Is it not so that we are not dealing in that verse with meat that touches any impure thing at all, even if it touched something that is of the second degree of ritual impurity, which is also called an impure thing? And yet the merciful one states with regard to that meat, which having touched a second degree impurity, it is now impure to the third degree. It shall not be eaten, meaning that it has been rendered unfit due to impurity. And as for the Baraisa's statement that the fourth level of impurity is derived by the kal v'chomer inference, it is, as we said just above, that the kal v'chomer inference put forth by Rabbi Yosei. This is tough stuff. If you're having trouble following it, just keep listening. It was taught in the Mishnah, and with regard to teruma, if one's hands become impure with impurity by rabbinic law that renders only the hands impure as opposed to the whole body, its counterpart, or that renders only one hand impure. So its counterpart, the other hand, remains pure. Right? So there are some things like touching a Torah scroll will render your hands impure. That's by rabbinic decree only. So what they're saying here is, so you only touched it with one hand. So now are both of your hands impure, or only the one that came into contact with the object that renders it impure? So with regard to teruma, now we're talking with regard to teruma. If one's hands became impure with impurity by rabbinic law that renders only the hands impure, so one hand became impure, does the other hand become impure? No, it remains pure. But with regard to sacrificial food, if one hand becomes impure, he must immerse them both. So one hand became impure. You can even touch teruma with the other hand, consecrated food that only priests can eat. But you cannot touch with the other hand, which is still pure, a piece of an offering that's going to go up on the altar in the temple. That's a rabbinic stringency to assure that for sure no impurity comes into contact with the sacrificial offerings. Rav Shezevi said, when they said that with regard to sacrificial food, a hand that is rendered impure renders the other hand impure as well, they taught this only for a situation when the pure hand is in contact with the sacrificial food when the impure hand touches it. But if the pure hand is not in contact with the sacrificial food, no, the pure hand is not rendered impure by touching the impure hand. According to Rabbi Shezevi, the sages enacted the decree that one hand renders the other hand impure because they were concerned that the impure hand may have touched the sacrificial directly without being noticed. Therefore, the decree applies only when the pure hand is touching the sacrificial food. Abaye raised an objection to Rav Shezevi from the following teaching. Even a dry hand that is impure renders its counterpart, i.e. the other hand, impure to the extent that the second hand will now render impure any food that it touches. This is true with regard to sacrificial food, but not with regard to teruma. So according to this teaching, even a dry hand, so this is the idea that fluids are necessary to transmit tuma. We'll come back to that. But this idea that this hand touched something that rendered it impure, this hand can touch teruma, but it cannot touch sacrificial food, as we said before. Okay, so this is true with sacrificial food, but not with regard to teruma. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says, the second hand is not rendered impure to such a severe extent. It can merely disqualify sacrificial food that it touches by rendering it impure to the fourth degree, but it does not render it impure with third degree impurity. This hand became impure. With this hand, I can touch teruma, I can't touch sacrificial food. But I do touch sacrificial food. What did I do to that sacrificial food? Did I disqualify it so that it can no longer be eaten? That's fourth degree impurity. Or did I render it impure such that if that sacrificial food comes into contact with other sacrificial food, it could transmit the impurity? Granted, if you say that the second hand becomes impure even when it is not in contact with the sacrificial food, this would explain the noteworthiness of a dry hand rendering its counterpart impure. It teaches that even though normally a dry hand would not render the other hand impure, the sages nevertheless declared it impure with regard to sacrificial food. This, over and over again, the extra stringencies for sacrificial foods. But if you say that when the second hand is in contact with sacrificial food, yes, the decree that the second hand becomes impure applies, lest the impure hand touch the sacrificial food directly. But when it is not in contact, no, the decree does not apply. Then what is the noteworthiness of stating that it applies in the case of a dry hand? What difference does it make whether it's a dry hand or not? It was also stated that the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, disputed a similar issue. Reish Lakish said they taught that one hand renders the other hand impure only if the second hand is his own hand. The two hands don't have to belong to the same person. What does that mean? I understand, like you're talking about I understand they would make a rabbinic decree that for sacrificial foods, if one of my hands is impure, then even though I am careful not to touch the sacrificial food, I'm going to only handle it with my right hand, which is still pure, that nevertheless they're going to say it's disqualified if I touch it. I'm not allowed to do that because I might make a mistake, a lapse of awareness, and let both of my hands touch the vessel containing the sacrificial food. But now they're saying, no. They're saying one hand belongs to one person, one hand belongs to the other. So how are we combining? Let's see. They taught that only if the second hand is his own hand, but an impure hand does not render impure the hand of another person. And Rabbi Yochanan said, an impure hand renders another hand impure, whether it is his own hand or the hand of another, provided that the second hand is touched by the same hand that came into contact with the impurity. Okay, so my hand is impure. I shook hands with you. Now your hand is impure because of the contact. That's not always going to be the case, but it certainly is the case here. Because remember, we're not talking about germs and cooties. We're talking about ritual impurity, which is sometimes transmissible and sometimes not, depending on the level of impurity. The Gemara elaborates on Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. From where did he learn this? We're on the B side of 24. From the fact that it teaches in a latter clause in the Mishna, for one hand renders its counterpart impure with regard to sacrificial food, but not with regard to teruma. Why do I need this phrase as well? It was already taught in the first clause that one hand renders the other hand impure with regard to sacrificial food. Rather, must one not conclude from this added phrase that it comes to include the rendering impure of the hand of another person as well as his own hand? And the Gemara observes, and Reish Lakish also retracted his own opinion in favor of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. For Rabbi Yonah said that Rabbi Ami said that Reish Lakish said, the decree that one hand renders another impure applies whether it is his own hand or the hand of another, provided that the second hand is touched by the same hand that came into contact with the impurity. If this hand becomes impure and this hand remains pure and I shake hands with another person, I didn't make him impure. But if I shake hands with this impure hand with that guy, then his hand can become impure with respect to sacrificial foods, but not teruma. The same hand came into contact with the impurity. Moreover, the impure hand affects the food it touches only to disqualify it, but not to render it tamei, to disqualify it from being used as an offering, but not to make it tamei so that it would transmit impurity further down the chain. The Gemara comments, in this opinion, that an impure hand affects the sacrificial food only to disqualify it, but not to render it impure. This itself is a dispute among the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, as we learned in the Mishnah, Yadayim 3:2. Anything that disqualifies teruma by contact with it, i.e. anything that is impure, at least to the second degree, renders the hands impure to the second degree. And furthermore, a hand that is impure to the second degree renders the other hand impure. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua. But the rabbis say, meaning the majority opinion, which became law, hands themselves are impure to the second degree, and that which is impure to the second degree cannot impart second degree impurity to something else with regard to non-sacred food, only for teruma or sacrificial food. From the rabbi's response to Rabbi Yehoshua, it is clear that the latter's opinion, Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion, is that the second hand is indeed rendered impure to the second degree, imparting third degree impurity to sacrificial food that it touches. Moreover, is it not correct to infer from the rabbi's words that it is impurity to the second degree that the first hand does not impart to the second hand by touching it, but impurity to the third degree it does impart to the second hand? This second hand would thus only disqualify the sacrificial food that it touches by imparting it to it fourth degree impurity. Therefore, the rabbis and Rabbi Yehoshua are arguing about this very point. Does the second hand only disqualify sacrificial food by imparting to it fourth degree impurity, that the sacrificial food is disqualified, but there's no further impurity that the sacrificial food could transmit to something else that came into contact with it? Or does it render the food impure with third degree impurity, which would mean it became impure and it could transmit that impurity? Right? Fourth degree impurity only exists with regard to sacrificial foods because of that extra stringencies that we take. Third degree impurity only exists with respect to teruma and sacrificial foods. For the vast majority of all other situations, there's only second degree impurity, and it stops there. So the Gemara rejects this proof. Perhaps the rabbis meant the first hand does not impart impurity to the second hand, to either the second or the third degree. For in their opinion, one impure hand does not defile the other hand at all, in contradiction to the Mishnah, whereas the opinion expressed in the Mishnah would be following Rabbi Yehoshua. Rather, perhaps the issue at hand, so to speak, the issue of which degree of impurity is imparted to the second hand is like the following dispute between Tanaim, sages of the Mishnah, as it is taught in the Baraisa cited earlier. Even a dry hand that is impure renders its counterpart, meaning the other hand, impure to the extent that the second hand will now render impure food that it touches. This is true with regard to sacrificial food, but not with regard to teruma. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says the second hand is not rendered impure to such a severe extent. It can merely disqualify sacrificial food that it touches by making it impure to the fourth degree, but not render it impure to the third degree. That's the second time we're hearing that exact teaching. It was taught in the Mishnah. One may eat dry foods, i.e., foods that have never been wetted and are thus not susceptible to impurity, right? For something to actually become tamei, a food, it has to also have to come into contact with the volition of its owner with one of the 7 liquids, water, milk, being 2 of them. So one may eat dry foods, i.e. foods that have never been wetted and are thus not susceptible to impurity, with impure hands in the case of teruma, right? The food cannot become tamei because it has never been wetted, so you could take a scoop of it and move it, even with impure hands, because you can't transmit impurity to that food because it's not susceptible to impurity. But in the case of sacrificial foods, no, even if it has never been wetted and it is not susceptible to impurity, if you have impure hands, you cannot touch that sacrificial food. One of those extra stringencies of sacrificial foods. And it is taught in a Baraisa that there is a difficulty with this statement of the Mishnah. Rabbi Hanina ben Antigonos said, now, is there such a possibility as dry food, i.e. food that is not susceptible to impurity, with regard to sacrificial food? Is it not so that the reverence accorded to sacrificial food itself renders it fit to contract impurity, even if it has never been in contact with liquid at all? All sacrificial food is thus automatically susceptible to impurity, and whether it is dry, i.e. it has never been wetted, or not, is irrelevant. Well, it might be irrelevant, but it still works, right? Whether if it's dry, you can't touch it with impure hands, only in the case of sacrificial foods. The fact that sacrificial foods, it doesn't matter whether it's wet or not, it's always susceptible to impurity, and that's why you can't let any kind of impurity come into contact with it. Just kind of squares with this teaching. Like, it's not really a contradiction, I would say. And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary for the Mishnah to state this. And the case is not one of dry sacrificial food as was first assumed. Rather, the reason this needs to be stated is that the Mishnah is dealing with a case in which, for example, his friend inserted sacrificial food or teruma into his mouth. Or alternatively, a case in which he inserted it into his own mouth by means of a spindle or a whorl, which are wooden vessels without receptacles that cannot contract impurity. Chopsticks cannot become impure because they don't have a receptacle at the end, like a fork or a spoon. So if you were able to pick up some food with a stick, the stick cannot become impure since it's not that kind of utensil. So now you're going to transport food to your mouth with such a stick. Okay, that's the case. So in either event, the food arrives in his mouth. Either somebody else puts it in your mouth or you use the chopsticks to put it in your mouth. So it arrives in your mouth without being rendered impure by his impure hands. And then, while the sacrificial food or the teruma is still in his mouth, he wishes to put into his mouth and eat a non-sacred radish or onion along with the sacred foods. Non-sacred food is not rendered impure by being touched with impure hands. So it should not be problematic to put a radish or onion into one's mouth with his hands. However, regarding sacrificial food, the sages enacted a decree against doing so, lest the person inadvertently touch the sacrificial food that's already in his mouth with his impure hand. This decree, the Mishna teaches, applies only to sacrificial food, but in a case in which he had teruma in his mouth, or he put teruma in his mouth with chopsticks, the sages did not enact a decree against it. And finally, the last little paragraph in the Gemara of our first Mishnah in chapter 3, it was taught in a Mishnah, an acute mourner and one who is lacking atonement require immersion in order to eat sacrificial food, but this is not necessary for teruma. The Gemara explains what is the reason for this. An acute mourner is one who lost his close relative that day. And one lacking atonement, as we said already, one who was impure, immersed, and is now, but had a heavy impurity where he has to bring offerings at the end of it. So he does not finish his purification process like one who has tsara'as, a mitzvah, right? One who has, not leprosy, but tsaras, that spiritual physical manifestation of the spiritual malady. So he's impure while he is a mitzvah. And at the end of the day, once he has counted 7 clean days, he immerses. He has to wait for nightfall, but he also has to bring certain offerings. And only until he finishes that is he completely purified. So he's immersed, night has come, but he still hasn't brought that offering, which he can only bring during the daytime the next day. So he's technically still impure. So the acute mourner, or one who is lacking atonement, require immersion in order to eat sacrificial food, but this is not necessary for teruma. The Gemara explains, what is the reason for this decree? Since until now it was prohibited for them to partake of sacrificial food, and they therefore might not have guarded themselves properly from impurity, the sages required them to undergo immersion before eating sacrificial food. That concludes Mishnah number 1 and its Gemaras. Mishnah number 2, we're just going to read this Mishnah, and then we're going to be done for today. How am I doing on time? And then I really got, you know what? I'm not even going to read Mishnah number 2. We're going to start there on Monday. As I mentioned, no class tomorrow night. And we will resume on Monday, God willing, with a double daf. I'm part of a Maganam training course tomorrow for the security of our synagogue. And it's going to go all afternoon and into the night. So no class tomorrow night, double daf, God willing, on Monday. Okay, let me see if there are any quick questions that I can take. Oh, and no questions, but Yosef comments, I just listened to a new lesson by Rabbi Manis Friedman. Wonderful speaker. You can find on our website, if you search for Manis Friedman and accidentaltalmudist.org. He was a guest here on AT Live. Beautiful. I mean, he just, and he was talking about marriage and intimacy, in Torah and Talmudic perspectives and Tanya perspectives. He comes from Chabad, on marriage and intimacy. Beautiful. Says Yosef, he was listening to a new lesson by Rabbi Manis Friedman where he delves into some mystical interpretations of the purity of hands. Just wanted to share that. Thank you, Yosef. Maybe I'll listen to that as I'm driving up to the tactical range tomorrow. Rabbi Friedman is always worth hearing. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. May you be blessed to begin every week the way you began this week, with some beautiful and deep learning of our sages.